When my parents told me they were leaving me, the warehouse, I honestly thought it was some kind of cruel joke. My older brother got the house, fully renovated, 3 bedrooms, landscaped garden, even the new SUV in the driveway. My sister received their savings account and my mom's jewelry collection. In me, I got a run-down warehouse at the edge of town. Peeling paint, rusted metal doors, a neighborhood people only drove past with their windows rolled up. At the lawyer's office, I forced a smile. "It's fine," I said, even though my chest felt hollow. The truth, it hurt. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the kid who didn't ask for much. My brother was the golden child. My sister was the emotional favorite. I was the strong one, the one who could handle disappointment. So when my parents passed and the will was read, I told myself maybe this was just another test. Maybe they assumed I'd figure something out. But as I stood outside that warehouse a week later, staring at its faded brick walls and boarded windows, I couldn't help thinking. Was this really all they thought I deserved? The metal door screeched when I forced it open. Dust floated in the sunlight cutting through broken skylights. The air smelled like rust and old wood. Inside, it was worse than I imagined. Broken shelves, old crates, torn tarps, graffiti on the far wall. A thick layer of dirt covering everything. "This is useless," I muttered. For a moment, I considered selling it. Even if I got a small amount, it would be better than holding onto a burden. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the faint memory of my father bringing me here when I was a teenager. Back then, he used to work on projects in secret. He never told my siblings about them. "Just me. You see things differently," he once said. "You don't just look, you imagine." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, standing in the dust and silence, I wondered if this place held more than junk. I walked deeper inside. That's when I noticed something strange. The floor near the back wall looked uneven. The concrete was slightly discolored, like it had been patched. I crouched down, brushing away debris with my hand. There was a faint outline, a rectangle. My heart started pounding. I found an old crowbar among the scrap and began prying at the edges. It took effort, sweat, and more than a few curses, but eventually, a section of the concrete slab lifted. Underneath it was a metal hatch. My hands trembled as I pulled it open. A ladder descended into darkness. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed in my mind. But curiosity won. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and climbed down. The air below was cooler, cleaner somehow. At the bottom, my light revealed something that made me freeze. It wasn't an empty basement. It was a workshop, but not an ordinary one. The space was immaculate, shelves neatly organized, tools polished, blueprints rolled carefully and labeled, workbenches covered with half-finished mechanical devices. It looked like someone had been working here recently. But that was impossible. My father had been ill for months before he passed. I stepped closer to the largest table. On it lay a set of detailed designs, inventions. Complex mechanisms I couldn't fully understand, but they were clearly innovative. My father had been an engineer in his younger years before switching to a stable corporate job. I always thought he'd left that dream behind. Apparently, he hadn't. In the corner of the room sat a locked metal cabinet, and taped to it was an envelope. My name. I swallowed hard and opened it. Inside was a letter written in my father's handwriting. "If you're reading this, then you've stepped inside with curiosity instead of resentment. That means I chose right." Tears blurred my vision. He explained that the warehouse wasn't an accident. It was intentional. He knew my siblings valued comfort and security. So he gave them exactly that. But me, he believed I wanted more than safety. He believed I wanted purpose. The workshop below the warehouse was his life's unfinished dream, prototypes and designs he never had the courage to pursue publicly. "I was afraid to fail," the letter said. "I don't want you to live with that fear." Inside the cabinet, he wrote, were documents, patents filed but never activated, business plans drafted but never launched, and a key to a safety deposit box at the bank. My heart pounded as I unlocked the cabinet. It was all there. Legal documents, detailed research, and at the bottom, a small velvet box. Inside was a flash drive. Over the next few weeks, my life changed completely. I spent every evening in that underground workshop, studying my father's work. Watching old video recordings he had left on the drive, explaining his ideas, refining his prototypes, even talking to me directly through the camera. "I hope you're the one watching this," he'd say in one clip. Because you'll understand, for the first time in years, I felt connected to him. Not as a distant, practical father, but as a dreamer. I quit my draining office job. Everyone thought I was insane. My brother laughed. You gave up stability for a broken building. My sister shook her head. You always were too emotional. But they didn't know what I had seen. What I had discovered. The safety deposit box contained seed money, far more than I expected. My father had quietly invested for years, preparing for this. Not for himself, for me. I partnered with a small tech incubator. Presented one of the refined prototypes, an energy-efficient modular system that had real market potential. Investors were skeptical at first, then impressed. Within a year, we secured funding. Within 2, the first product launched. The warehouse above, renovated, not into luxury, but into a creative hub. Exposed brick, open workspaces, a small cafe in the front, a sign outside with our company's name, built from my father's initials. The underground workshop, I kept it exactly as it was. Untouched, sacred. The day our company turned its first major profit, I stood in that hidden room again. I ran my hand across the workbench and whispered, "You weren't wrong about me." My siblings still live comfortably. The house, the jewelry, the savings, and I don't resent them anymore. Because I finally understand, my parents didn't leave me a warehouse. They left me belief. They saw something in me I hadn't yet seen in myself. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't polished and obvious. It doesn't sparkle like diamonds or come with leather seats. Sometimes it's dusty. Sometimes it looks abandoned. Sometimes it feels unfair. But if you're brave enough to walk inside, to dig beneath the surface, you might discover that what looks like nothing is actually everything. So if life ever hands you a run-down warehouse, don't turn away too quickly. There might be a hidden door waiting for you to open it. And behind that door, your real beginning. Success didn't happen overnight. After securing initial funding and officially launching the company built from my father's designs, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The first major challenge came 6 months after our prototype announcement. Manufacturing costs were higher than projected. A supplier backed out at the last minute. One of our early investors began pressuring us to simplify the product, which really meant stripping it down until it lost everything that made it innovative. I remember sitting alone in the renovated warehouse office late one night, staring at spreadsheets glowing on my laptop. The exposed brick walls that once inspired me now felt heavy. The cafe lights were off. The building echoed with silence. For the first time since discovering the hidden workshop, doubt crept in. What if I wasn't the right person to carry this forward? What if my father had overestimated me? The pressure wasn't just financial. It was emotional. Every decision felt like it carried his legacy on its back. Every risk felt personal. I went downstairs. The hidden hatch creaked softly as I lifted it and climbed into the underground workshop. Down there, everything felt steady. Frozen in time. Safe. I sat at his old workbench and opened one of the notebooks I hadn't read yet. On the inside cover, he had written, "Progress always looks messy before it looks meaningful." I let out a shaky laugh. It was exactly what I needed to read. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something new, margin notes beside several designs. Calculations revised, alternative materials suggested, backup systems drawn in careful detail. He had anticipated failure. He had planned for setbacks. And suddenly I realized something important. He hadn't left me a perfect blueprint. He had left me a process. The next morning, instead of accepting the investor's demand to simplify the product, I called a team meeting. We spent 12 hours reworking the manufacturing model from scratch. We sourced smaller suppliers. We redesigned certain components without sacrificing the core innovation. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. 3 months later, we delivered our first full production batch. The response exceeded expectations. Orders began trickling in, then pouring in. Local media picked up the story of the warehouse startup. Soon, national outlets followed. They loved the narrative. Forgotten building, hidden workshop, father's dream reborn. But the story they didn't see was the exhaustion. The sleepless nights, the moments of fear. Success can be just as overwhelming as failure. With growth came expansion. We hired engineers, designers, marketing specialists. The open workspace upstairs buzzed with energy every day. The cafe became a networking spot for young entrepreneurs. People began calling me visionary. That word made me uncomfortable. Because every time I heard it, I pictured my father in that underground room, quietly sketching by himself, afraid to take the leap. If anything, I was just finishing what he started. About 2 years after launch, I received an unexpected call. It was my brother. We hadn't spoken much beyond surface-level updates since I left my office job. There had always been an unspoken tension between us, not hostility, just distance. I saw the interview, he said awkwardly. The one about Dad. I stayed silent. I didn't know, he continued. About the workshop. About any of it. Neither did I replied. There was a long pause. I think I misunderstood you, he admitted. I thought you were chasing something unrealistic. But maybe you were just braver than I was. It was the first time he had ever said something like that. A week later, he asked to visit the warehouse. When he walked through the renovated space, he looked impressed. But when I led him to the hidden hatch and down into the workshop, he stopped at the bottom of the ladder and just stared. He brought you here, my brother whispered. Yeah, he never brought me. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just realization. In that moment, I understood something else my parents had done. They hadn't divided us by value. They had recognized us by nature. My brother valued stability. He thrived in structure. And that was okay. I thrived in uncertainty. Different gifts for different souls. Not long after, my sister visited too. She had always been emotionally close to our mom, and for a long time, she believed I had been secretly favored. But when she saw the workshop videos, the recordings my father left explaining why he chose me for this path, she cried. He believed in you in a way that scared him, she said. I think he saw himself in you. That hit harder than any business milestone. As the company grew, we expanded beyond my father's original prototypes. Our team began developing new technologies inspired by his principles. Sustainability, efficiency, accessibility. We opened a second facility in another city. Then a third. The old warehouse, once an embarrassment, became our headquarters, a symbol of transformation. We kept the exterior brick mostly unchanged, a reminder of where we started. 5 years after I first opened that rusted metal door, we hosted an anniversary event. Entrepreneurs, investors, local officials, employees, hundreds of people filled the space. String lights hung across the exposed beams. Music echoed against the walls that once held nothing but dust. Before giving my speech, I slipped downstairs one last time. The workshop was exactly as I had preserved it. I ran my hand over the blueprints. I wish you could see this, I whispered. But in a strange way, I felt like he could. When I returned upstairs and stepped onto the small stage, I looked at the crowd, at the faces of people whose livelihoods were now connected to this once forgotten building. I didn't talk about revenue. I didn't talk about growth metrics. I told them about doubt. About fear. About walking into something broken and choosing to see potential instead of decay. This company, I said, exists because someone believed that imagination is more powerful than comfort. The applause was loud, but what mattered most was the quiet sense of alignment inside me. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the warehouse. I thought about the day I first walked in, resentful, disappointed, feeling overlooked. If I could go back and speak to that version of myself, I'd tell him. You're not being handed scraps. You're being handed responsibility. And responsibility is heavier, but it builds stronger shoulders. Over time, I began mentoring young founders who reminded me of myself years earlier. Talented but hesitant, capable but unsure. I'd bring them to the warehouse cafe, let them absorb the atmosphere, and eventually tell them the origin story. Not to inspire them with fairy tale success, but to show them that opportunity rarely arrives polished. Sometimes it's disguised as a burden. Sometimes it's wrapped in dust and disappointment. One evening, a young engineer asked me, if your parents had just left you money instead, do you think you'd be happier? I thought about it carefully. Money would have been easier. Less risk, less stress, less fear, but easier isn't always better. No, I answered honestly. I wouldn't trade this, because the warehouse didn't just give me a career. It gave me clarity. It forced me to confront my insecurities. It pushed me beyond comfort. It taught me how to build, not just products, but resilience. Years passed. The business stabilized. Profits grew steady rather than explosive. I found balance, something I had neglected in the early grind. One quiet afternoon, while organizing old files in the underground workshop, I found one final envelope tucked behind a shelf. I had somehow missed it before. Inside was a short note from my father. If you've come this far, then you've already done what I couldn't. You chose courage over certainty. Whatever happens next, remember this, the real inheritance was never the warehouse. It was your ability to see possibility where others see ruin. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my wallet, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of myself. Today, when people drive past the building, they no longer see an abandoned structure. They see innovation, opportunity, growth, but I still remember the dust, the rust, the disappointment, and I'm grateful for it, because if everything had looked perfect from the beginning, I might never have looked deeper. And if I hadn't looked deeper, I would have missed the hidden door. The ladder, the workshop, the belief. Life rarely hands you a neatly packaged destiny. More often, it hands you something that feels unfair, incomplete, even insulting. The question is simple, will you walk away, or will you step inside? I stepped inside, and behind that run-down warehouse, I found not just my father's unfinished dream, but the courage to build my own.